doing this or is it?
DJ House of Pain. Yes, I like this one. Emo right is emo right.
Hello, and welcome to Focus on Liberia. This is our debate Friday night. That's Friday night debate. We are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. Sorry, we're having some technical difficulties, so we're going live on YouTube. Let's wait for Dr. Duke so we can begin the show. Dr. Duke, where are you? At this time, I'm going to switch it over to my man, Mr. Asuni CA, who's going to introduce the topic for tonight.
Mr. Jah, thank you. And again, we can apologize enough for the technical difficulties we are having here. Focus on Liberia. We believe the application that we're using is overwhelmed because of the coronavirus. There are a lot of people using it, but we are here and we are live on YouTube. And so as we are getting started, we want to welcome you to our broadcast. This is Friday night debate here at Focus on Liberia. And in today's debate, we are debating the issues surrounding the Fernando crisis sometime back in our nation's history. And we want to understand whether that was an international conspiracy or the charge was completely accurate as was being leveled against the Liberian government. So this is what we have here to debate. And to go into this conversation or this debate, we have Dr. Duke. That is Dr. Duke here. We call him Dr. Du is here. Dr. Du, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
All right, Dr. Du there, happy to be here, excited about the debate. Also, His debate partner here is Mr. William Kane. Mr. Kane is a member of this family, Focus on Liberia. Welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, folks, in cyberspace, as you can see, the stage is set for this very, very important conversation. To get a conversation started or the debate started, I will now turn it over to my man, Dennis Jai, who is leading today. Mr. Jai.
Sometime in our nation's history, there was taking people to the island of Fernando, where they were as slaves. They work and they didn't get paid. And so there was an international committee set up to investigate. That committee, called the Christie Commission, found the government of Liberia guilty and some charges were labeled and people had to be fired. So this is part of our history and we must talk about it. So that's the Fernando crisis and we're going to go deep into it. The question we're going to be answering tonight is the Fernando crisis, what really happened? What's the true story? So we're going to dig deeper in the history tonight. So we have two men who will now call on Dr. Abdoulaye Douklé. First, Dr. Duke, say a little bit about yourself, and then followed by Mr. William King, say a little bit about yourself, and then we're going to come back and talk about what your take on the Fernando crisis. Dr. Duke. And Dr. Duke, if you can shift on the side a little bit, this side. Perfect.
So?
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. Yeah.
Well, there's not much to say about myself, except I'm a teacher, I'm a writer, I'm a journalist, and I follow everything that has to do with Liberia from the day people started off thinking about creating a country called Liberia until I was born. And so I'm a writer, journalist, teacher, and also been involved in politics.
Thank you, Dr. Duke. Let me go to Mr. William Thomas Bernard King. Little bit about yourself, Mr. King.
Well, thank you very much. I think for the purpose of this show and for the debate that we're having right now, what I want to say is that to be unequivocally clear that I'm the great-great-grandson of CDB King, who was the president during the time of the Fernando incident. I also am a Bernard from Tommy Bernard, who owned Yes Transportation. That's where my mom comes from. And there are multiple presidents that I share familiar relationships with because of the just how things happen, not to control that or anything like that. Definitely very familiar with the Fernando I live in California with my wife and my son. I work in the utility industry for 13 years and I do real estate. I'm a part of Focus on Liberia and definitely would like to look at the Fernando from my perspective at least. I don't think that we look at it within the geopolitical context of what happened.
And we'll come to that. We'll come to that.
Yes.
That was just a little bit about yourself. So let's get into it. The Fernando crisis, as we stated, was it an international conspiracy or what really happened that as we read about in history really did happen? So in this debate tonight, we're going to have each of our panelists going at least 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes for any time we ask you a question. If you go more than that, we're going to let you know that you are going more. If you continue, we're going to mute your line. And then we will discuss this and bring in our audience or viewers to ask questions. Please share the show. We are not used to going live on YouTube. So on YouTube, we don't have that many viewers, but this is where we are. So Mr. King, I want you to get the ball rolling. Your take crisis. What's the
Thank you.
Story?
Thank you. I think it was a conspiracy. I remember now, to be clear, I did not say that the forced labor did not occur and that the leadership did not have to take some responsibility. But I believe that it was a bigger geopolitical conspiracy attacks against Liberia. This is what I want to say. And I quote from George Padmore, "The gesture of the Yankee slave master in the role of champions of the human rights is enough to make the proverbial cat laugh." Another quote by Che Guevara, "I believe that Africa is important for North American imperialism, especially as it reserve. If Africa calmly develops its system of neocolonialism with no great commotion, investments could be transferred there. It has already begun as a way of ensuring survival, for that vast and immensely rich continent has hardly yet been tapped by imperialism." And because of the purpose of time and so forth, the last part, and just let me know by my time. According to Padmore, Du Bois, and Azikiwe, the interests of the League of Nations in Liberia reeked of hypocrisy. Many observers have asked, how is it that Spanish Guinea and French Gabon, where some of the laborers had been sent, could escape blame? Azikiwe thought it odd that the so-called commentators on Liberia's affairs have failed to drag Spain in unequivocally terms without mincing their words into this international debacle. One American journal observed, "The Liberians do not export slaves without inducement, and in this case, the inducement apparently comes from the Spaniards at Fernando Po." The Associated Negro Press questioned the absence of much concern over the European role and noted that when the League delegates learned that France and Spain were the nations to be censored, the matter was dropped. There was not even a suggestion that Paris or Madrid be asked to explain. The crisis said that Spain and France deserve quite as much censure as the Liberian government. I hope I was in that time. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Dr. Duke.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd like to thank Mr. King for his introduction. I think he went through the heart of the issue. What was the reaction from some Liberians and some Americans? I think the problem we are confronted with is, I don't think it's about what people say about what happened. The issue is, did it happen or did not happen? And what were the conditions that led to that event? You have to, if you start with King and then go forward, what happened to him, what happened to his vice president, and what happened to Tubman. Tubman was part of the group that resigned out of that scandal. You missed the whole point. It had to go back to Firestone. The setting up of Firestone as an entity, as a concession that led to that issue. So, Mr. King, you may be right and say, yeah, people may say, yeah, it was wrongly done. Europeans were still doing forced labor in part of Africa. France was doing forced labor in Africa, but they were doing it in the names of building local infrastructure. They were doing the same thing in Senegal. Ben Ousmane wrote about it. But that's not the issue that bring this discussion. I think the thing is about, did it happen or not? And what was the impact on Liberia as a nation and as a country? And I think you have to go back a little bit, the role that Mr. King played, the President King played in bringing Firestone into Liberia, because that was the most defining moment in our economic history. What happened to Firestone and how Firestone got into Liberia, and what role President King played into that process are really the issues. Because I don't think there was any debate about forced labor in Liberia. I mean, people did that. I mean, people got paid to recruit fighters, to recruit boys to go to Fernando Po.
All right, so let's take a step back for the sake of our viewers who may be hearing Fernando Po for the first time. Dr. Duke, let me start with you. What happened to Fernando Po? Give us a summary. And Mr. King, you can come and buttress that.
I think it was back in 1912 when the Spanish government passed an agreement with Liberia to recruit, how to call them, boys to go work in Fernando Po. And they mostly recruited from the Kru. And that was back in 1912. And then they stopped it at one point in 2021. 1921, when people said, oh, people complaining about the conditions of working, all of that, they stopped in 2021. And they restarted the same agreement in 2028 to bring more workers into San Fernando Po. So it was an agreement between the Liberian government and the Spanish government, and they needed people to work in Fernando Po. The other aspect of it is that was during, before Mr. King became president, but he became president in 2024. So when he became president, he reinstated that thing. And that's because of his linkage with Firestone. And I keep saying, you have to go back to Firestone to know the whole history of this issue. The issue is not that President King was the blameless, the number one guilty man because it happened on his watch. But the reality is that he has to go back to Firestone because that's the whole thing that drives on. And if you want to separate Firestone from King and Firestone from Fernando Po crisis, you will not get the whole picture because they're all linked up. It's not separate. It was all about labor. How do you get cheap labor from Liberia into Portuguese Guinea? How do you get cheap labor into Gabon and Cameroon? And don't forget, 23,000 people from the crew land were also working on German ships. And Firestone had to compete to get people to go on their farms. So you have to put everything into context. It's not just saying Mr. King was guilty or not. His government was, running a slave system. What was his personal role? That's something different to discuss, but definitely that's a problem. So that argument came back, and then in 1927, Mr. King was running for a re-election. He ran against Mr. Faulkner, a guy who was a former mayor of Monrovia, who was very popular, but he was running on the ticket of no to Firestone, to reboot Firestone, to send Firestone back home. And King was important to Firestone to stay on. So King went and won the election against Mr. Faulkner. It's Thomas Faulkner. You remember when they say Liberia is in the book of records, that's when it's happened. He won by 243,000 votes against 9,000 to Mr. Faulkner when there were only 15,000 registered voters. That's how important the issue was. And because he and Firestone were working together, and then when the issue came up, Faulkner then wrote an article in a Baltimore newspaper. And that article said what was going on in the country. Not only that the man cheated, he gave the numbers of the election, but also added, oh, well, he also sending people to work as slaves into Fernando Po and pocketing money out of it. When Roosevelt became president of the United States, his Secretary of State, who was a friend of Firestone, Mr. Firestone, the owner of the Firestone plantation, heard the story. He said, no, we have to investigate this. We cannot be part of it. We are friends of Liberia. We cannot go along. So he asked for government to investigate. Mr. Barclay, who was Secretary of State at the time, said, no, this is not important. We dealt with this in the past, so we're not going to do it. But then the issue went to the League of Nations, and the League of Nations asked Liberia to set up a team to investigate. And that investigation came up with a guilty verdict. And a group of people in Monrovia decided to write a petition to the assembly, and the assembly voted on the petition, and the petition impeached. They didn't impeach anybody. They just asked Mr. King and his vice president, Mr. Yancey, to resign. So this is the background, political background of it.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. King, have anything to add to that on the whole story? You are on mute.
I have a whole lot to add to what was just said by Dr. Abdullahi, basically painting this, I guess, portrait that back in those days, people approach things with this righteousness of good-heartedness and so forth and everything like that. I want to take a step back, and I want to address a few things that he mentioned within a bigger context, because I think people need to understand this. So number one, Faulkner that you mentioned, Faulkner was really good friends with Marcus Garvey. And as a matter of fact, when they came for the settlement, a lot of those items that were being shipped to Monrovia were being shipped to Faulkner. So Faulkner was not someone that people may look at and say, oh, you know what, this was a champion for the cause. The other thing I want to mention is that Firestone, Harvey Firestone, make no mistake about it, it was a business decision that was really made. And that relationship with President King, I don't want anyone to get the idea that it was a warm, fuzzy relationship. It was a relationship that was formed based on contractor agreements and certain things that we're going to get into a little bit later as we talked about it. Now, understand that labor, you'll find it very interesting that don't forget that this commission was formed. This commission is not it's not something that's there to discuss strategy. Geopolitical strategy is not handled by this commission. And the appointment of individuals on this commission is done for a very clear, specific purpose, and they are handpicked because these are people with a certain personality and so forth. So they're instructed from the operations side to go out there and execute what the strategy is. It's very interesting that if you notice, they separated forced labor from slavery. How is it that you're going to have the things that took place on Fernando Po? They were all, during those days, looked at as forced labor. Every single one of those items there. But all of a sudden for Liberia, it's coined into slavery. And the reason why they did that was because if they had said forced labor, that means that they would have had to implicate Britain, the US, Spain, and all those other countries that were in Africa conducting certain things. Now, you mentioned President King. The whole idea with Spain was that here you have this island and they need labor. And you have President King going there and telling them, hey, listen, in a few months, I'm going to basically be ending this contract and we're going to be going away because we have a deal with Firestone. Now, if you are Spain and you hear that, do you think that that's going to sit well with you? I think you're going to have a very hard time. So let me read this and then I'll give back the table. This is a quote from Brothers and Strangers, and it's a real quick. In 1926, the Liberian news both assured and threatened the planters of Fernando Po that the labor demands of the American Firestone Company would have no effect on the shipment of workers as long as our boys are treated more humanely than heretofore by the authorities at Fernando Po. In March of 1926, CDB King visited the island and explained to his planters association that Liberia was about to embark on a vast program of internal development. A message amplified in an address to the Liberian legislature by the following October. The president's statement implied a future termination of the labor traffic. Again, the island faced the prospect of uncollected cocoa harvest and financial ruin. This bleak future seemed real when in late 1927, the Liberian Secretary of State terminated the labor agreement of 1914 without a 6 months notice. This rupture, like its predecessor, caused consternation in Spain, Guinea. Liberia apparently had Fernando Po at its mercy, and before agreeing to a new convention, it sought a preferential tariff for its coffee and other produce. Thank you.
Mr. King, so
Yes.
in your view, what actually happened?
Where?
Fernando Po.
Oh, in my view, there was forced labor.
Okay.
And in my view, that was forced labor that the government had a hand in it at that time. The government engage in a private-public enterprise where it supported, not only did it sign a contract agreement, but it supported the labor going there. And they forced individuals to go there without their full consent. And they engaged in various tactics to help fulfill that contract. However, one thing to be noted for sure is that the agreement was there will be payments made to the laborers and that the conditions of working and so forth would be something that was decent. And upon discovery that Fernando Po was not able to fulfill its obligation, they looked at other labor ways, because the economy of Liberia was not one of sufficient export, and our main product at that time, unfortunately, was labor export.
Mr. King,
Yes.
you said it was a conspiracy because in the case of Liberia,
Yes.
they term it as slavery.
Yes.
But when the Westerners,
Mhm.
who also had engaged in similar agreements and dealings, they
Mhm.
refer to it as forced labor.
Yes.
So it's on that basis you came to the conclusion that this is conspiracy against Liberia. Is that what you're telling us?
No, I came to the conclusion that it's a conspiracy to try to throw Liberia under the bus, because one has to realize that they will not say the term, they won't use forced labor, because if they did, they would be found guilty of it too. And now the other thing, I want to be very clear with this. See, I want everybody to realize this. And I'm not just coming with some stuff that I'm pulling out. This thing about forced labor was bad by the folks who were pushing the League of Nations to investigate. Britain, France, England, they were pushing this investigation, and they were pushing this investigation also to counter against the US because of the whole rubber situation. Like Dr. Ablai mentioned, we can't use that as a separate thing, it has to come in. And they use all of these things to prevent progress. So yes, and also the fact that it was a stench to them that they are colonizing this whole West Africa, and there's this small little Black Republic nation. And we have to understand that racism was very strong. And the other reason why it was a conspiracy was because Marcus Garvey of the UNIA, he was going around threatening that he would start the Black movement for Africa, which in essence would be to kick all of the colonial powers out of Africa, and that the birthplace through which he would start this movement would be Liberia.
Thank you.
And this was, yeah.
Thank you. And Mr. Jai, you go ahead.
Yeah, let Dr. Du respond.
Yeah, a lot of information, and I think we agree on one basic thing, which is that forced labor was happening and people were being recruited forcefully. At the time, Mr. Yancey was the vice president, was getting something like $45 per head for young person. They call them boys. There's a distinction. The colonial powers starting with the US to investigate what was happening in Liberia was a reality of what was going on at the time. And we must also say that colonial West Africa was one story, Liberia was another one. Liberia has signed, was part of the signatories of it was actually Mr. King, President King, who was Secretary of State at the time, who went to Versailles in Paris to sign the 1919 peace agreement with the big powers. Liberia was considered to be a big power, sort of. But what was going on was going on. So I don't think we should say, okay, the Marcus Garvey followers who also say, we were the first one to get to Liberia. Marcus Garvey said we were planning to move 3,000 people, business people, engineers, doctors into Liberia to create a strong Liberia. And they went to Liberia and signed an agreement with the King government, but somehow in between the first ship of Mr. Garvey coming in and whatever happens, Mr. Firestone discovered Liberia, and Garvey followers were deported. Once they landed in Monrovia, they left 200,000 worth of material. So I think we can, that's what I'm saying. We can separate Firestone from what happened into the League of Nations. You know, I don't know if you got that point when I said the man won an election where there were 15,000 people registered voters, but he won 243,000 votes, and the opponent won 9,000 because Firestone wanted him to stay. That was his fight with Faulkner. Faulkner wanted to review the Firestone issue. He wanted to keep Firestone out, well, at least review the Firestone deal. And King was the one who said Firestone has to stay. And either we like it or not, maybe Firestone was good for Liberia at the time as a nation that was broke, that had no money. So he was looking for protection from the US on the way and also getting from some cash. But it's probably set Liberia on the wrong economic course because we have not been able to correct that problem. We have been, struck. That Firestone deal has set Liberia on the worst economic path ever in regarding concessions. So we have never been able to correct that. And King did that. Those are the issues that I'm concerned about. I'm not concerned about the forced labor and the slavery because those things happen. Germans were using Liberians, French were recruiting. Can you imagine if you look at the border between Ivory Coast and Liberia? On one side of the Ivory Coast, you got thousands, millions of people. You go on the Liberian side, nobody there. Why? Because people were forced to move out of the land. People were forced to be taken as, to go work on different lands. So
Dr.
those
Doe.
things are, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I have to ask a question. As somebody who really doesn't have much knowledge about this story, except hearing it now and reading about it later today, my question is, Liberia went into this agreement you said earlier with Spain. So in any agreement, a country must stand to benefit. What Liberia stood at the time to benefit for which they enter into this agreement in the first place?
Liberia was supposed to get $45 for every young man that was sent to Fernando Po.
Okay.
And I think $20 for women because boys needed women. Mm-hmm. And it happened that the President King, when he re-engaged the process, left it to his vice president. And the vice president was the one running the show. And he was taking the money, not paying the people, and telling them that whatever money the company was paying was going to the families. But the families didn't even know where the boys were going. Because sometimes they take you in Sino, they say you're going to jail. You don't go to jail, they send you to Harper. And then from Harper, they put you on a ship to Fernando Po. That's happened to thousands of people.
Yeah, and from my reading today, I learned that most of the boys and also girls who were taken were forced from their family. It's not like they more than voluntarily agreed to go to Fernando Po as workers. That was not the case. Is that true?
No, they were not. They never agreed. These were raids. People raided villages at night. They would take the boys one side. They sometimes shoot the other people, and then they carry everybody who was of age of working. And that was done by the Liberian Frontier Force. That they, bring the background to the Liberian Armed Forces of Liberia. But the Frontier Force job was to do that. They did it for Firestone. What you have to understand is that, the whole Fernando Po, what I will agree with Mr. King, is that it was a red herring to take our eyes from Firestone, because Firestone was doing exactly the same thing. Firestone was asking the government for quotas, and government was asking commissioners, town commissioners and everybody to bring a number of people to work for Firestone. And in compensation, what they got a little farm and they got people working for them. That's what I'm saying. The Firestone model of development has been probably the curse of Liberia, because we keep repeating the same model.
Yeah, and you said earlier, sorry, that you said earlier that I don't know, was a king or one of those leaders at the time. The money that should have come to the country as benefit went to him. Was that proven anywhere in the investigation?
Oh yeah, he received the money. Yeah, definitely, yeah. Actually, they recommended that he be impeached by the House, and they recommended that President King be just resign. There was no doubt about it. Tubman was part of it. The former vice president was part of it. The former vice president of Mr. Before Yancey was part of it. All these guys are part of it. It was not a small conspiracy. People made a living getting a plot of land from Firestone, get workers to work for them. And it was like Firestone was actually paying people, government people to work for them by using Liberian labor and Liberian land. The first time Firestone opened up, they used 50,000 acres out of the 100,000, 1 million acres. They used half of it. But the other half, you know what they did? They passed it on to government functionaries. And those government functionaries were able to use those land to raise rubber for Firestone without paying labor, because the laborers were working for Firestone. So it was like running a government in the government.
Wow.
Dr. Duke, before I go to Mr. King, my question to you is, you are connecting Fernando Po to Firestone so strongly, but if laborers were required for Firestone, why would they take those laborers and send them to Fernando Po? Does it mean we had surplus laborers that needed to work in all those places?
Yeah, but because Firestone was running out of workers. Firestone was running out of workers. You can imagine everybody was actually recruiting from everywhere. The French were recruiting, the Germans were recruiting for the ship. They said the crew people know how to swim or something. They're sending young Liberians to Gabon and Cameroon. That was the case. And Liberians made money out of the labor. The government made money out of the labor of those people. And sometimes the money never went into the government coffers. It went into personal, people's pocket. And it created a conflict where Firestone could no longer get enough workers, really. Because that was also part of the problem. So there was a competition for the labor force.
Mr. King.
Yes, thank you. I just want to pick up there, and I want to put this in something global. And I think I don't know if I'm not going to contradict, but I think I'm going to add something to what Dr. Ducle said.
Before you come there, I just wanted us to be clear, because you are not denying that the people were forcibly recruited. These people that were taken to Fernando Po, including some who may be related to me, because I remember they said my grand uncle cried for days because he was not sent. Because for some people, they thought they were going to explore the new world. They say, well, let's go. You are going to just like when we come into America. So the story here is people were forced. They were supposed to get paid. They didn't get paid. That money went to individuals, including Vice President Yancey. Which part of this story is conspiracy? Is it the investigation, or is it that those things really didn't occur? Were they exaggerated?
No, but they were not exaggerated to what you're saying, to what you just asked, to what you just stated, Dennis. But I want to say this, right? A couple of things. If we take a step back, if you recall a few years ago, I'm not saying it was popular or whether it was popular or unpopular, that's debatable. But remember, at some point, there was a general consensus that Monrovia was way too crowded, and that we had a lot of people that were just idle in Monrovia, and we had very rich land, and that we should have more people get into agriculture and so forth. And I remember going to Liberia and just observing everything that was going on. And the fact of the matter was that the folks that we had, a lot of them are not interested in doing agriculture work. They're not interested in that type of work. And so just want to keep that in a context that even today, a few years ago, we were saying that, hey, whether some of these people like it or not, they should get into agriculture work because they're sitting down. There's nothing for them to do in Monrovia. So until this day, 70, 80, 90 years later, we're still facing some of these same challenges. To your point about this whole thing about this forced labor conditions, let me say this. It is easy, this is a quote also, it is easy to see that the actions of Yancey and Ross constitute a gross abuse of power and divorce of its context, that the Black Republic labor traffic seemed particularly repellent, meaning it was disgusting, that it was to its victim, it was repellent to its victim, which is something you just mentioned. However, when compared to the tremendous abuses perpetuated throughout the Africa by the colonial powers, the operations of Yancey and Ross appear puny. Now, what does that mean? Yes, what it means, and I don't want us to downplay this because we often do, and I don't want us to downplay this. There were still other colonial offenders. One horrendous example comes from Central Africa. In the French Congo, the French built a rail line parallel to the one in Belgian Congo, enormously expensive in terms of human life. The rail line served no essential economic need. It was begun in 1921, and it did not complete until 1934. By the time it was completed, 127,000 individuals had labored on it for at least a short period. Conditions were terrible. Many of the laborers came from savanna areas, southern Africa, in our country, West Africa area, East Africa areas, and were unused to the tropical areas in which they were obliged to work. The overall mortality rate reached a yearly 100 per 1,000. It reached as high as 240 people per 1,000. There was a total of 45 dead for each mile of track for 317 miles. So when we look at that, let's keep that in mind. Also, back then, to Dr. Duclé, I don't know if you consider inflation, but it's actually now pound sterlings. Liberia, we used the sterling. We didn't use the dollar until a little bit later on. Now, for Firestone story, yes, Firestone signed an agreement for 300,000 laborers. And once again, when people look at this stuff, we can debate the contract for Firestone on another day. But you'll be surprised that Liberia did not have 300,000 laborers to give to Firestone at all. So Firestone was very upset. He was very upset that this thing happened. And so his position was that, how can I get as much labor as possible to Dr. Duclé print? Now, everything sounds innocent until they started to then turn and say, hey, you know what? Because the workers are going to Fernando Po, how can I cause them to stop? I can use this thing about they're doing slave trade and everything like that, because also they were squeezing Firestone, because they would tell him, hey, I got some workers for you, but I'm going to go somewhere else because they're paying me a little bit more. So all of these little things that was happening within that context around that situation made it where they knew that in order for Firestone to win from the US side, they had to do it. Now, from the colonial side, the British, the Spain, and so forth, they had no interest of seeing Liberia win, because here was this very small nation that was part of the League of Nations, and that was going around this Black Republic causing a stench. And it was really they were looking at this thing as, hey, this is a very small place on the map, and we should be able to just go in there and take it over. And once the League of Nations came into power, which was why Liberia had to be on there, because we saw a transition slowly not completely, but where,
Mr.
sorry, one more point, sorry, where the war for a nation to remain independent was now being fought with words,
Yeah.
not force.
All right, you cover a lot of ground, but one thing I want to point out, like you gave the example of Central Africa.
Yes.
So you were saying this is conspiracy because people were doing worse things than Fernando Po and they were never brought to book. Is that
Yes, yes. What I am saying is that when we look at that, Liberians should really look at this Fernando Po, that we were attacked from all angles in order for these international groups to come and take Liberia from us. And they use all of these things to come and attack us in such a way that we look at at that point in time, we're looking at each other, Liberians and so forth. We begin to target and label each other and say that this guy is a slave trader, this person is this person is that. And we actually would not even label the colonial powers as that. So we turn on each other.
Okay, can I come in from
Sure.
this? Yeah, I think this is where, Mandela said, somebody kick you in the butt. It doesn't matter if it's a white or black person, somebody kick you in the butt. And I think trying to justify what happened in Fernando Po with what happened in colonial Africa does not help us move, the goalposts forward when we talk about reconciliation and all of these things. You can justify what happened in Liberia. People came from the US with the aim of establishing a new republic with their brethren in Africa and create a new republic where black men is happy. And then they sell black men, women to another white man to get money out of it. I don't know how you can justify that by saying French people did worse. I don't care if French people killed 1 million people in Gabon or 200,000 in South Africa. I worry about what happened in Liberia, in our backyard. And what happened is that the Black Americans, the Afro-American who kicked Marcus Garvey out, who stopped the migration of Black progressives coming to Liberia, connived with Firestone to create an economic model that Liberia is still suffering from. And King was part of that. He was there at the beginning, giving Firestone 1 million acres of land, the most fertile part of the country. And he was there at the end, because at the end of it, he became lawyer for Firestone after he left the presidency. So I'm not trying to say, we can talk about the context. We can talk about the context Liberia defending itself, but US was defending Liberia. In fact, to pass the concession, I think Barclay said, maybe because when they were signing the Firestone concession, they asked them to borrow $5 million from a bank. This is so tricky. Firestone coming to Liberia to open a concession, tell Liberia, okay, here's the concession agreement for 1 million land, 1 million acres, but we also want to give you a loan for $5 million. So you'll be obligated to the US and you'll be obligated to somebody else. But all of these things happen Mr. King did all of these things. And he was part of it. And at the end of it, he retired on his plantation, a rubber plantation that was given to him by Firestone, with workers paid by Firestone, and he was a lawyer for Firestone. And we not say, okay, what about French did to Senegal or Gambia or whatever? They had nothing to do with this. This is a country that was supposed to build on the redemption of the black man. Mr. King, I'm sorry to say that. But yeah, okay.
What to William's point that Firestone wanted these liberals, so it makes sense to kind of engineer that, hey, people are engaging in slavery, so when it stops, then Firestone benefits.
No, Firestone didn't really go after. Firestone was not the one who started it. When Faulkner, the losing candidate who lost the election by.
No, I mean Firestone didn't want the forced labor in Fernando Po to happen, to succeed, because Firestone wanted the same liberals.
No. It's not like Firestone was okay with it as long as they were going on. As long as they were, everybody was doing it, it was okay. But when Faulkner lost the election, and as Mr. King said, he's a partisan, he was a supporter of Marcus Garvey Black Redemption Movement to move Liberia to move Black people to Liberia. And they always claim that the land that was given to Marcus Garvey was the same land that was given to Firestone. So that issue is there. There's no problem about it. I don't think there's any doubt about those. I just don't think that, we're doing justice to history when we say the French people did this, the English people did this. French people were doing forced labor up to 1945 when they were investigating forced labor in Liberia. But Liberia was supposed to be an independent country. That was the difference. It was supposed to be an independent country, member of the League of Nations, that was not supposed to have slaves. Pounding, pounding was done in all cultures, but they turned it into something different in Liberia during those days.
But what do you say now to the international community, if you may, that found problems so much with Liberia if those things were going on in other places because Liberia was independent and shouldn't do it? I mean, the abuse of human rights is the same whether you are a territory, a country, or a protectorate.
Somebody come into your house and slap you. Are you going to ask the man or the woman, did you slap my neighbor also?
No, but I would say it's unfair because if you are the big brother who is refereeing slapping.
No, I'm not saying that there's no point of erasing the issue of fairness. We don't have to deal with that. It's not our problem. What happened in Mali? What happened in Senegal, building the railroad? What happened in Ivory Coast, cutting the plantation and building coffee and all of that thing? That's not our problem. Our problem is what happened between Liberia and Fernando Po. What happened to Firestone? Who gave 1 million acres to Firestone and promised to hire 300,000 people when you could not put 20,000 people together in one place? You had no control over the hinterland. Those are the issues. So we shouldn't say, oh, French did it and they be hypocrite. Yeah, let them be hypocrite, but they became independent. Those countries became independent. Liberia is still dealing with this issue. We're still trying to find out who did what. Mr. King may not be directly involved in the slavery issue, but it happened under his watch. As a head of state, when you allow people to steal, to do the wrong thing, you're worse because you're giving the example to the whole state to steal, not just one person.
Mr. King.
Yes.
Why is this important about what's going on in other parts of Africa? If you are not denying that those gruesome conditions went on in Fernando Po under the watch of President King, and this was Vice President Yancey and former Vice President Ross, they profited hugely. So why are we talking about Central Africa and the other places where slavery were going on?
I think, to Dr. Abdullah's point, if you take the position that I just focus on my home, what's going on in my home, what is right, I'm just looking at my home, then all these other things doesn't hold any weight, or it doesn't have any justification or like anything like that. But if you're looking at Liberia as a country and say, does Liberia exist in and of itself in a shell? Was it self-sustainable? Was it able to manage itself? Then once it got into the international arena, now you under the microscope and you under the playing field. And something that we must understand is that the British and the French, they took some of Liberia. So Sierra Leone, some of Liberia went to Sierra Leone, and some of Liberia went to Ivory Coast. So if you can sit down in your house and say, hey, these things doesn't affect me or impact me, and just sit by and say, I'm just going to drink my coffee, sooner or later, your home and everything is going to be grabbed by these colonial powers. So something that must be very important, and I want to stress this, you have to look at the global context. Let me tell you something about Marcus Garvey.
Before you go to Marcus Garvey, how did the global context exonerate Liberia or make what in Liberia less of dehumanization? How does the global context help us to understand that Fernando Po was not that bad?
First, to be clear, when we look at it, when you compare forced labor, like I give you the example where 45 people die per every mile of a railroad track. When you look at that and you say, okay, in Liberia for the Fernando Po, the folks that went there, I'm not condoning it, but when you look at it, do you say, hey, people that went there was 1,000 deaths, we sent 3,000, or we sent however many, and we lost 50% due to the torturous conditions over there. And did we do anything to stop that, or were we sending more labor? I just provided you proof that CDB King, when he went over there and he saw the conditions and so forth that was there, that they had put something in place to basically stop that, but still recognizing that you had to provide some form of work and employment for your country, Liberia. And at the same time, you had to find a way to preserve your sovereignty, because you had the English, you had the English and the French taking your land. So at that same time, you had to preserve it. Hence, that Firestone deal was critical, because it sucked in the US. It sucked the US into a role on the continent of Africa that the US was trying not to be involved in. And if the US could have found another place to grow rubber, they would have gone there. But as things would have it, as Providence would have it, our position and situation was so ideal, because they have familiarity with the continent, and it was something that they could drive with. They could not do that on any of the British colonies or the Portuguese or the French, because those guys were not trying to give America anything. So for us, Liberia, if you look at it from the context, like I said, Marcus Garvey deal was not something that we would have gotten. He promised us $3 million in a bond $2 million when we went for that loan for the $5 million. And Marcus Garvey was not able to fulfill on his obligation to us. He only raised like 150,000. So when he was talking about coming to fulfill certain things, it did not happen. And he spoke about Pan-Africanism. Liberia is a true example already of Pan-Africanism, but we had to make some corrections. To be clear, we had to make some corrections. But what Marcus Garvey was trying to do, we were already doing it. We were light years ahead of him. And he has some discrepancies on his books and everything. And the other thing was that he talked too much. He was a blabbermouth. And if we had let Marcus Garvey come to Liberia at that time, we did not have no military might to sustain any kind of military engagement from Britain or France. So that Marcus Garvey thing for Liberia was not effective. Pan-Africanism, Liberia at that time, we had people coming from the West Indies, we had American Liberians, we had people from other African countries, and we had the indigenous people. However, we had to make some corrections with how all of us could come together. But his idea was something that was already there. And I have to defend something Dr. Douglas said. I want to defend that. Well, I have to.
You will please jot it down, because you've gone like
okay.
5
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, because there's a comment here on Facebook that I want to read, because I was bringing up the Garvey issue later, but you
sorry. I'm so sorry.
All right. Monju said, besides Fernando Po, President King also made history by winning an election by 600,000 votes over his opponent Faulkner when electoral roll had less than 15,000 voters. President King also undermined Marcus Garvey's attempt to repatriate blacks to Liberia. So you touched on that. But Dr. Duke, let me read this from historian Samuel Ngovo. This is what he wrote. Was the Fernando Po forced labor a policy of the Liberian government headed by President CDB King, or the actions of few officials of the government of Liberia who were involved and opponents of King's administration in persons of D. Tue and T.J. Faulkner, who were also Garveyists in Liberia, to paint the Liberian government as being responsible for the forced labor crisis? Remember, Garvey had promised to raise money to settle Liberia's financial obligations to the USA, while at the same time negotiating with the King administration to establish the UNIA in Liberia. W.E.B. Du Bois and Garvey could not see eye to eye. Du Bois visited Liberia in 1923 and impressed on King administration not to allow Garvey venture into Liberia, with the promise of Garvey of having Firestone investment and the payment of whatever money Liberia owed the USA. King administration thereafter rejected Garvey's venture, and his supporters such as Tue and Faulkner were unhappy, and they were the first to alert the US government and the League of Nations about the activities of King's administration. Christie Commission set up by the League later found out it was not the policy of the King administration, even though some of its officials like Yancey were implicated. It is a complicated history of Liberia. The British and French did like Garvey because of his pan-Africanist venture in Liberia. They too were against any support from Liberian government to Garvey venture. Any accusation of the Liberian government and official were taken seriously. Regional politics and international conspiracy were involved in the Fernando Po labor crisis against Liberia. So Mr. King will respond to the comments on YouTube from Moyu, and then Dr. Doug, you respond to Mr. Govo.
Can I go first? Because
yes, sir. Yes, you.
Okay. No, I think his comment about Liberian government responsibility is not totally correct. The first treaty between Liberian government and Spain was in 1912. That was a government treaty. It was stopped in 2021 when people complained about the condition of working condition and all of that. But then it was reactivated in 1927 by the government. So it was a government entity. It was supported by the government. And according to records, the Spanish were paying $45 per head for every board. And after you get 1,005, they give you another 5,000. So that was the conditions. Where the money was supposed to go, who was handling it, this is where it became murky. We don't know exactly how the whole process was set up, but it was set up by the government. It was stopped. It started in 1912, stopped in 1921, and then it restarted in 2019, 27, 28 by King government.
William.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis. I want to respond to the caller about that election. So here's my thing with that, okay? Now, President CDB King was a man of the people. And so this whole, Western philosophy that you have to register to vote and all of those things, when he realized that the man must have a chance to vote for who he wanted to be put in office. So he reached out to as many people. And so, for those people who wanted to restrict those people, but I just say that joyfully, I say that in a jovial manner because that's part of our Liberian politics. What I say is that I was not there at that time, at that situation. But obviously, as we all see from the records and everything like that, politics. And I have no idea how those things came about. And I sometimes laugh
Because it was important for Faston to have the men in office to renew the concession agreement.
Mr. King, do you call that election fraudulent?
Who, me?
Yes.
Oh, my man, I plead the fifth on like that one.
Okay. Yeah, it was recorded. It was recorded as the most fraudulent election in the history of mankind.
What I want to say, Dennis, is that you know, President King just realized that a lot of people needed to be involved in the election.
Remember now, the natives were not voting at that time.
I have to research that. Is that true? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because you need to have a title, deed, and then deed can only be given to citizens of Liberia, and citizens of Liberia were all American Liberians.
Right. Thank you.
So they alone at voting age couldn't reach that number, but
no, I mean the opposition got 9,000. Maybe that was the real number for the opposition out of the 15,000 votes.
Yeah. Do you know how many? Do you know that Marcus Garvey, UNIA, they offered $1 per acre compared to the 6 cents? Do you know that? But it is still now. Whether he was able later on, he did not have the capability to fulfill something like that. Let it be known, and that's recordable. He did not have the financial ability. So although he said he was going to pay that much, there's questions about whether he had the ability or not.
So what does that mean?
But that's a narrative. That's a very colonial narrative against Marcus Garvey. The narrative that he was all talk and no substance, and that he promised to liberate Africa. He didn't have the means to do it. I think those, and then that he sent he sent 3 people. The first delegation of Marcus Garvey went to Liberia, came with something like $200,000 worth of items. And they were put back on the same ship, but they took everything else from them. So they were not just playing. And the election was not just a game. It was not, I think you laugh about it. It's kind of serious because that election was pushed because Faston was going against Mr. Faulkner, who was anti-Faston. And the idea was it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't matter how you do it. Mr. King had to be in office. And Mr. King won by 243,000 votes to 9,000 to his opponent when there were only 15,000 registered voters. And that gave Faston every leverage that they wanted. And they signed everything they wanted to sign. You can't separate Faston from King. I think that's the problem, we probably have.
I got a question then, Mr. Duklin. I got a question for you. Then why was it that the League of Nations investigation was encouraged by Firestone?
It was not encouraged by Faston. Faston didn't want to be part of the investigation. They tried to stop it. It was the government of Liberia that was pushed by Roosevelt, President Roosevelt of the US. When he became president, his Secretary of State knew Faston. And then when the issue come up, they say, hey, you could go either way. Business setting, you say, okay, you could go either way. Either you go along or you oppose it. And it was easier to say, let's point finger to Fernando Po. But the Faston forced labor continued. Faston never stopped doing the same thing. They never stopped asking town commissioner to bring quotas of young people. That never stopped.
All right, let's look at the other segment on the Christie report. And then our final segment will be on the impact of Fernando Po on Liberia. The Christie report found Liberia culpable of forced labor in Fernando Po. As a result, President King and his vice president resigned, and the Secretary of State Barclay took over as president. My question to you, Mr. King, what was the conspiracy about that too? Oh,
no. There was once once the play field had been set, the chess pieces on the board had been put down, there was nothing more for the report to just take its course. The fact is the fact that there was forced labor. There was nothing to deny that. I think that what the Western world, what they did not anticipate, and what they got was, they got someone worse than CDB King to their cause in office, and they got a political juggernaut and a political astute guy in the form of Barkley. Now, we have to understand something about Liberian politics within the true Whig setting, okay? And it's very interesting and very strategic here. At that time, President Daniel Howard was still alive, I believe. And then also the first Barkley was still alive. And then you had CDB King now. So you had three presidents looking at this thing from just a whole bigger picture now. And now you have pretty much a ferocious pit bull who took power. And let me tell you something, Barkley, it was under the Barkley that they suspended payment for the Firestone deal. It was under Barkley that Firestone kept going in their letters writing to the US State Department that the US should in some type of way bring a Navy over there, because how is it that this guy is withholding payments from them? They wanted to basically have these district governors that were foreigners to run Liberia, and it wasn't going to happen. And you had a very beautiful.
William, what's the connection?
Between who?
Between Barkley being this guy who extended, who's being ferocious. What's the connection with the? Oh,
he had all the advice. He had all of the mental, I guess you can say, shrewdness and political thoughtfulness. I mean, these guys, they play politics because Liberia was going to be swallowed. So they played it on the biggest world field, and they played this thing in such a tremendous way. They had lobbyists because, you know, Firestone was at their neck. Firestone was good friends with I think it was, I think, before Hoover, who had a thing where he's like, hey, the US government supports businesses and the state gets behind businesses. And so they had all of this going against Liberia. And all these presidents were able to talk, speak.
So you're saying Barkley was colluding with the international conspiracy?
No. What I'm saying is that they got worse. You know, it's like this the saying, right? The devil you know is better than the devil that you do not know.
Yeah, I disagree.
And,
well, let me go.
No. Well, I'm just talking about within this Fernando Paul Firestone
because
context.
I don't get what I don't get is you say, hey, you fired CDB King, but Barkley came and Barkley is worse. Is in essence that what you're saying?
Yeah.
So we could have lived with the fraudulent election, the Fernando Paul crisis, instead of taking this guy out and bringing in Barkley, who's worse. That's your point.
No. What I'm saying is that, no. My point is that all of these guys that were part of the true Whig, this whole true Whig thing, right? The political party, right? What I'm saying is that it was a display of in union strong, success is sure. Because yes, don't forget, CDB King stepped down. And one of the things he said, I will only resign if Yancey steps down. If Yancey resigns first. Now you have to ask yourself, why did he say that? Well, he said that because, of course, these things were happening. He's a leader and his responsibility, but he wasn't going to let this guy become vice president. Become president, right? So he wasn't going to let that happen at all.
Okay, let me go to Dr. Drew, and we're talking about the Christie report.
Yeah. I don't think there's any dispute about the report as the culpability of the Liberian government as people being forced into labor, and I don't think there's any problem about that. And I keep saying, yes, he, as Mr. King just put it, Barclay was probably a step ahead of King, because he said, no, we are not going to go back. We're not going to pay this loan at the rate you give it to us. First, can you imagine? Liberia was forced to take a loan, $5 million that it didn't need to sign the concession agreement with Firestone. People think about, we talk about it in passing, but it's very important to imagine, because Liberia has never been out of debt since then. Because the economic model that Firestone brought, the concession model that Firestone brought has put Liberia in a straitjacket. So anyway you look at it, the Christie report was addressing one little symptom, which is Fernando Po. But the whole concept of forced labor in Liberia at the end of either taking Liberians to Gabon, taking Liberians to Cameroon, or to Fernando Po, or putting them from Sino to Lofa to work for Firestone, from Lofa to work in Sino for Firestone. It's the same concept. The nation was built on slave labor. Slave labor, people being taken from their homes to be sent to work and not getting paid. People who went to Fernando Po, we don't know what happened to them. Mr. King said, yeah, we don't know what happened, but we don't know if they lived or died. Nobody knows. We don't know how many people went, because people were coursed from the villages to put on the ship overnight, shipped over, and all they have to do pay 45 cents per head. And who was getting that 45 cents? We don't know.
Thank you. Let's wind down and talk about the impact. I think Dr. Duke, you kind of hit on it a little bit, saying that we have never been debt free since then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about it. Let's continue with that on the impact of Fernando Po on Liberia, even up to today.
I think the impact, talking about the debt issue. First, when Liberia entered, when Firestone came with a $5 million something that, we're going to loan you money you don't need, money that you never asked for, but you're going to pay 7% per year. And then from that money, you're going to loan some to us as Firestone to do work for you. This whole thing is so murky and dirty when you think about it in terms of human rights, in terms of colonial power using Africa and using, just the raw human power to do things. How do you want to? There's no conclusion. There's no good way to look at it. There's no good way to look at it. And the legacy is, if Fernando Po was part of that market labor, that Liberia was just used as a market for human labor. It goes for Firestone, it goes for the Ivorians who recruited them from Gabon, or even to build some ports in Ivory Coast. It goes for the German who recruited 23,000 Liberian crewmen because they said they could swim. And that whole thing has sort of changed Liberia. The Fernando Po is part of the big scheme. It's part of the big exploitation of labor. And Firestone used it. Can you imagine when you take 1 million acres from a small country like Liberia, 1/10 of its arable land, you are moving thousands of people from the land. Those people become laborers, or they become paupers and they move to another country to start a new life. So these things are happening. I think this is the legacy we need to think about. It's not just Fernando Po. Fernando Po was the symptom of a bigger ill. And that bigger ill is the exploitation of Liberia as a labor market. And that labor market was created, started with the concession with Firestone. And we are still inside because every model we have so far, every concession model that goes on is about how things went with Firestone. We can't change it. Every government that comes in came into Firestone. And Liberia has never been out of debt since 1906 when they took that first debt, I don't know, $600,000. It kept multiplying. Firestone came up every now and then, and it's always the same thing. Just like last year, they were talking about Americans coming to watch over Liberia economy. It's the same thing that happened back then. They used to have people, Americans, French people, collecting taxes at Liberia port of entry to pay their debts, the debt that Liberia owes them. So there's no good outcome from Fernando Po because it's part of a bigger scheme. It's part of a conspiracy of the colonial powers, but it's a conspiracy against us as a people.
Mr. King, one of the Dr. Duke is describing this as the bigger ill is the liberal labor market starting with Firestone, of which Firestone was just a symptom. Will you see the Fernando Po crisis and its impact on Liberia as the bigger ill?
I think I wouldn't say that it was a bigger ill or the biggest ill, because that was something physical that happened that took place. But I do believe that it has contributed to what I believe is the constant stream or challenge for Liberians to face the reality of the current situation and to always transfer blame to someone else. And that has, I think, hindered us from developing. But those marks, and I think we can have another conversation where we can debate Firestone, because I don't want to go off on that road. So yeah, so to your
So what do you see as the impact of Fernando Po on Liberia, even up to today?
I think that the impact has been more of a distrust, has been more of a I guess you can say an extra layer for us to engage Liberians openly. You know, if you're from Sino and I'm a American Liberian, I think that at the beginning, we may say, oh, okay, what is this guy angle? What is he trying to do? I know a little bit of his history, the things that happened in the past. This is what they're capable of doing. And I think we always have to kind of get over that hurdle before we can engage in true, genuine friendship and conversations.
Thank you.
Now, I have to say this. We always ask the question, why? Why did we have to take that $5 million loan? The question is, I always say, if you're gonna come and debate something, is what was the alternative? And I don't know what, if we have time to discuss what the alternative, and why is it that Liberia needed a loan? I don't want to address that.
No, I can respond to that quickly in 1 second.
Go ahead.
Is that, you know, when Firestone sent a delegation to Monrovia to negotiate with the government about the 1 million acres and stuff, he was left with this to send a proposal. He sent 2 proposals, one for the 1 million acre of land, and 2 to obligate Liberian government to a $5 million loan. When the report came to Monrovia, the agreement came, the government rejected it, saying, no, we don't need this because we still have to pay the 1906 loan that is still hanging us. We have to pay $160,000 a year, and we don't get more than $150,000 or $200,000 a year in customs duties. So they refused. And Fatou went back and said, okay, we put it through a bank. And the US government came back and said, Liberia, you can reject this, but in the end, why do you want to reject something that would develop your country? Those are the terms of the State Department. And Barclays said, to enforce the agreement, Barclays said, if the US lend you money, they'll protect that money. So that money is protection for Liberia. I think that can answer your question. Barclays saw it as a protection for Liberia because US gave you $5 million, they'll protect you to make sure that you pay those $5 million.
Right. And I don't want us to open new area as we are concluding.
Yeah.
Monju C also on YouTube said the descendant of Liberians in Fernando are known as Fernandinos. They reside at the island of Bioko. This is recent history. Their offsprings are part of the state of Equatorial Guinea. Anybody have a comment on that?
I went with President Sirleaf in 2015 to Equatorial Guinea, and there was a young woman, I think she was a doctor. She came to see us. She said her grandmother had come from Liberia, part of Fernando, and she lived in a village where almost everybody spoke Bassa Kru. But we didn't go to the village, but she came to see the president to say that her grandmother, a great grandmother who was still alive, wanted her to talk to a Liberian that was 2015. And she talked about a village where they all live, people live, communicate, they still speak the languages and everything.
Thank you. So, Mr. King, you have any information about Liberians now in Fernando, in Equatorial Guinea?
No, I would love for, no, I don't. I would love for Dennis, you, me, Dr. Duclay, if, by God's grace, I would love for us to see in the future, if it's financially feasible, for us to maybe take a trip. I would love that. What you said, Dr. Duclay, really sparked my interest. And Dennis, what you asked really did. I had thought about it once before, but I think now I'm going to research more.
And the reason I asked that is because sometimes we forget the actual human beings involved in this, and we talk the politics. Because Fernando people were, from what I learned growing up in southeastern Liberia, a lot of the people were recruited from there. So we have some extended family members that were part of this. And because of the Fernando crisis, there were also Liberians, especially from Southeast, that went on the ship either to Sierra Leone, Nigeria, because we had a man, because the way they call Sierra Leone, they say Senon. Ghana, they say Kose. Nigeria, they say Dikase. So that's how and these people, they when they were taken for years, when they came back, the only one I saw, he remained unmarried when I was a boy. And there was something a little different or peculiar about them. So whatever they did on those ships, we will never know.
Well, seafarer, you go on the sea for 9 months, 10 months. Yeah, there were 23,000, according to records, 23,000 crewmen on German ships before World War II.
And how were the people getting there? Was it Air Force labor or?
No, they were recruited. They were, most of those guys were recruited at the port, either in Sino or in Monrovia. They were recruited by Germans, and then they were paid directly. They were not paid through people, unless Fernando Po, somebody will grab you, and then they pay that person. But people who went on German ships were all people who went voluntarily to, they trained, and then they got on the ship, and then German, 23,000 of them from crew land.
Right now, if you go in my area and you hear the name Paul, They are referring to Fernando Po.
Okay.
So let's conclude.
Thank you.
Let me start with William. I think, let me read a comment from Dave. He got some strong words here for you.
Yes,
He said,
Dave,
Mr.
that's my
King-
brother, regardless of how we go back and forth. I love you, brother. Go ahead.
He said Mr. King needs to be humble and seek knowledge. He should also apologize to the Liberian people and FOL. I don't think his view reflect the principles of FOL. He said you were apologetic to what happened in the Fernando crisis. We'll speak to that and you can conclude.
Thank you. Well, I mean, of course, I was not alive at that time, and I wasn't the one making those decisions, and the leaders in the leadership seat and so forth. And to be very clear, to be sure, I think that anytime someone is forced to do something, work for someone, or work and they do not want to, I think that it is not good, and I think that it is definitely wrong, and that should not have been something that should have taken place. And I'm of the same strong position that 400 years prior to our ancestors doing the slave trade and having those slaves go to the US, going through the horrible Middle Passage. I think that was horrific. And also slavery in the US was something that was definitely bad. And I think that is something that we know history, and that is something that we should not repeat. So I think that I addressed that, Dennis.
And you bring that up of the transatlantic slave. You brought that up to make a point that we are all familiar with. That is, I don't know if that's what you are alluding to, that it was Africans, native Africans, that sold their brothers to slavery, and those brothers came back, and they in turn enslaved those they left behind. So
no, I bring that up. I bring that up strongly to say that the human nature, we need accountability, and that have nothing to do with Africans as a whole. It's just the fact that we as humans, looking at the situation and everything like that, there are some decisions that we look back and we say, hey, you know what? This was not something that maybe I had an alternative.
Thank you. Dr. Duke, your conclusion.
Yeah, my conclusion, I don't think I want to go back to what he just said, which is, I think in a sense we agree on the fact that Fernando Po was bad. And I think we agree on the fact that Fernando Po was not an isolated case in Africa. It was part of the colonial behavior. They pick on Liberia because Liberia was supposed to be independent and part of the League of Nations, but also because there was a conflict between Firestone and Fernando, people being recruited for Fernando Po, and all of its shortage of manpower. So there are a lot of issues. But I think the whole thing we need to learn from it, what we need to take from Fernando Po and going back to in the first concession agreement that was signed that put Liberia on a path of new path of economic development that has not worked, and it's still not working. And every year we keep signing new contract, So that's the thing we need to look at. What happened has happened. And some people pay for it, some people did not. Mr. King, a lot of government people participated in that process. It was not just King and Yancey and Ross. Tubman was part of it. His farm was a gift from Firestone, all of those things. And people got a lot of, if you go back in the records, you see how government people were giving land and manpower to grow rubber that was sold to the same company. So, but how do we get out of this process? How do we go back to say what happened cannot be repeated again? How do you free Liberia from that, we still do the same thing. So we're going to have the same results. Sorry.
Thank you. Well,
Yeah.
well, gentlemen, I want to thank you so much.
Dennis, I gotta tell you, that's not fair. You didn't give me close. I responded to Dave Job, but that was in my closing.
Oh, I wanted you to close, with that, but go ahead and close.
Okay, 1 minute. Dr. Ducle, this is something that I've given a lot of thought about.
Yeah.
So I will say this, that for the most part, we Liberians in the diaspora and Liberians in Liberia, we have the economic capability and the economic capacity to develop our country now, and the technological tools available. And I think that we will be challenged to see Liberia grow and develop as long as we continuously ask the Western world and other people for financial help while we keep our money in our back pockets. That's just something that's challenging. And so I also want to thank you for coming on and us discussing this topic. I think it's very relevant, and I think it's part of what Focus on Liberia is about: educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberians. And for all of our viewers, if there's anything that I said that needs to be corrected, that I stated from a factual position and so forth, please let me know. And look forward to another round of discussion. Maybe we'll discuss Firestone so much in depth. But thanks, everyone. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Dr. Ducle. And Anson, I know you had to go. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of you. And for all those watching, I want to thank you also for watching. Tomorrow at 3, we're going to have our FOL Marketplace. And at that time, we're going to be discussing the economic impact of the coronavirus, and also provide some financial tips on what we can do during this time. And at 7, we're going to have another discussion that is on the appointment of the boss, the new NEC boss, Mr. Councilor Nambodiki. We're going to discuss that within the context of the Proposition 1, and also, the state of our integrity institutions. So please keep tuned. Until then, my name is Dennis Jah, closing on behalf of all of us here at Focus on Liberia. I say good night and God bless you.